committee members and guests, welcome to our committee meeting this morning. Today we're doing an informational briefing on the Geological Survey. The folks are here, and what we're kind of going to keep this pretty informal. He said if we have questions along the way you want to ask, feel free to ask those for Mr. Calbus is here. Jay is in charge of the situation. So with that, welcome to the committee, Mr. Calbus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to set my timer because I'm told that we go for an hour, and I want to make sure that we have time for lots of questions at the end, if there are any. I've put folders in front of the entire committee. They look like this, and I wanted to kind of orient everybody to what I have within those folders. So on the right side of the folder, there's a color printout of this presentation today. So hopefully this will help you all to kind of keep on, and it's a little bit of a graphics heavy presentation, so I'll try to keep everybody oriented with page numbers. We're moving forward with a funding request, with a funding enhancement request. It's in the House right now, and commensurate with that, I've put in letters of support that we've received from across the different different agencies, both public and private, so you can read those at your leisure. On the left-hand side of this packet, there's some small cards. In the front, you'll see an invitation to you all to attend our legislative field trip, which this year is going to be in southwestern Kansas. It's going to be on June 7th through the 9th. So we're really looking forward to that. It's going to be a different one. We're going to focus almost wholly on water resources. You're going to have a chance to touch the High Plains Aquifer itself, the Ogallala Aquifer, where it crops out. We'll go to the town of Lakin. We'll be in Dodge. We'll be in Garden City. We're also going to have a chance to go to an oil and gas field. So Berexco's been very kind to open up a field. So we're going to talk about oil and gas resources. We're going to talk about water management as it relates to those resources. Behind those small cards, you'll find a number of heavy cardstock infographics. These are essentially one-stop shopping for many of the key issues that we have within the state of Kansas. So you can read about the High Plains Aquifer, both surface water and groundwater. You can read about earthquakes. You can read about critical minerals in the state of Kansas. So these are meant to be informational for you, kind of the key things that you'll need for your districts, for your areas within the state. On all of those, there are also small barcodes on the back lower corners. You can scan those barcodes with your cell phone, and it'll take you to the website where we have all kinds of information about those issues. So thank you very much for having me. I am grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you all on behalf of the men and women of the Kansas Geological Survey. This is an institution that has been in place since 1864, and we've been housed, co-located with the University of Kansas since 1889. I'm myself a newcomer to the state of Kansas. I came here from a career in oil and gas, so I worked for ExxonMobil for 16 years, all over the world, but mostly in Houston, most recently in Houston, Texas. So, you know, my work, my background goes back to my PhD work in geology and geophysics. I am a geologist and worked across a spectrum of different research modes, as well as business development and management within ExxonMobil Corporation. We may have fallen asleep. Okay. Perfect. Great. Thank you very much. So the Kansas Geological Survey has the duty to provide clear and data-driven information about all of the geological resources of the state of Kansas. This is very much, can you see it? Okay, great. This is very much an evolving role. It started with mineral exploration. It started with oil and gas exploration. Our mission has evolved to a distinctive focus on water resources management. You'll see that I'll focus on water resources throughout the conversation today. This is an institution with world-class representation. We're a major research institution. I characterize us as one of the country's largest geological surveys. So we're third only after Illinois and Texas. Texas has about 200 individuals. The Kansas Geological Survey has about 130 scientists and staff and students. So we're a world-class organization. You can think of us as a very large geological survey, state geological survey, or you can think of us as a relatively small national research lab, which is effectively what we are. Again, our mission is to provide information about the geological and natural resources of the state of Kansas. We have a focus, though, on economic development, on water quality, water quantity, natural hazards, and then we also have unique capabilities in digital technology integration. So a lot of what we work is doing the characterization and the analysis of our resources, but then bringing out geological characterization into the digital world. There we go. We have 6 major programs at the Kansas Geological Survey, and again, we are host to some of the world's greatest scientists, folks from Stanford, folks from Wisconsin, folks from a range of different universities, Duke University, for example. We do programs in energy research, and that includes oil and gas, hydrocarbon research, so a lot of work in our fields, especially in the central Kansas uplift and across the western part of the state. We also do work in carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration. We're the center of development for new concepts in hydrogen development for the state of Kansas, which are new and quite exciting. I'll talk a little bit about that a little later on. As many of you will know, we're the center for all of the science that's done, or much of the science that's done within the state of Kansas in water resources. We have a focus in groundwater resources management through our water level monitoring programs. We're growing a water quality research program, or I should say regrowing that program for the state of Kansas, and I'll talk about that. We also do aquifer modeling, which is incredibly important with respect to understanding how fluid is moving through the state of Kansas, and I'll talk about that. We do digital technology integration. We have a very large archive of data. This is both rock data, so core data, as well as cuttings from over 450,000 wells throughout the state of Kansas. That is our window into the subsurface for the state of Kansas, and it's a priceless data set that we manage and that we take care of. We do work in geophysics and geohazards, and this is an exciting and growing area for us, where we're working not only throughout the state of Kansas on the civil side to identify risks and hazards, things like sinkholes and mine collapse risks, but we're also applying that technology to the military and homeland defense arenas. And so those technologies that we've developed here are now deployed in places like, or were deployed in places like Afghanistan and places like the demilitarized zone along North Korea. That's coming from the state of Kansas, and to me that's really exciting. We also do work, very importantly, on the geological resources of the state of Kansas. So this is kind of, you can think of this as the classical geology, rock hammers, as well as a lot of computer power to do subsurface mapping, to integrate all that core work back into the maps and the frameworks that we need to go and harvest those materials where appropriate. I'll turn to page 4 now of your packet. This graphic I put together to try to explain the very interesting relationship that we have between service on the right-hand side, research application in the middle, and then pure research on the left-hand side. This is a symbiosis, effectively, an integration that we've learned to create here at the Kansas Geological Survey. It relates on the research side to us assembling some of the world-class resources and scientists and engineers that we have. So from the national level, we bring in tens of millions of dollars into the state of Kansas from organizations like NASA, like the National Science Foundation, like the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and the United States Geological Survey. So our resources, our scientists have the notoriety to be able to attract those dollars, attract those resources for pointed projects that are important to the federal grant lending agencies. Mr. Chairman, I'm excited that you're going to learn about the fossils of the state. So I fully support that. As a state geologist, I support that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, if you bring back a fossil, please don't ask me to identify it. Okay. Very good. So there's a critical relationship between state support on the right-hand side, which supports the services that we do, the groundwater monitoring system that I'll talk to you about, the groundwater quality systems that we talk about, the hazards maintenance stuff. All of that relates back to the Kansas taxpayers, the Kansas citizens. We're supported. We work interdisciplinary ways with all of the different state agencies of Kansas, all the way from wildlife and parks to the Kansas Water Office to even the Department of Revenue, where we have applications of our digital technology for understanding our tax basis with respect to fluid flow through pipes, through pipeline systems. In the center is a representation of some of the private organizations that we work with. So we're involved with the oil and gas producers of the state. We work hand in hand with them on a day in and day out basis. We work with the APA. We work with salt manufacturers within Kansas. We work with some of the high-powered laboratories, both the national labs as well as MRI Global, to ensure that we're integrating the best technology, and that when we have ideas, when we have technology, that it is applicable throughout the state and throughout the country. So these relationships, again, are extremely important. And that symbiosis of service to research application to research is the essential thing that makes the Kansas Geological Survey the entity that it is. We're able to bring in some funding from national resources. We're able to then turn that into applications that are impactful for the state of Kansas. We do service work that develops into research findings that we're able to then bring back out to our neighbors in the region as well as throughout the country. I'll turn the page now to page 5, and this is a representation that I drew up when I was sitting at the Governor's Water Conference listening to Governor Kelly speak last October. And I sketched this out to be able to show that the Kansas Geological Survey is intermixed certainly in 3 of the 4 critical steps in natural resources management. And this is the way that I've kind of characterized it. So at the top, there's measurement. You cannot do analysis and assessment work without measurement, of course, and that's a big part of what we do. That then turns into analysis and assessment that allows our scientists to evaluate and then to report out on the natural resources of the state of Kansas. Effectively, the conditions in nature have to be reported out so that the planning process can begin. We're active participants in that planning process. Our duty is to bring information to the decision makers about the spectrum of different planning options so that then decision makers can make their decisions. And of course, when those decisions are implemented, we have to move back again into measurement and see how we're doing. So this is the critical sort of life cycle, I would say, of observational science, of assessment and analysis, and then policy implementation. I'll focus for a good little bit of time now on water resources. And please, when you have questions, I really hope that you'll ask those questions. I want to make this really relaxed and fun. So I characterize our water programs really with four indispensable systems. There are four programs that serve to work together to ensure that we have the right information about our surface water, how that interacts with our groundwater resources, and then that we have the proper analyses in place. So the first one, number one here, is water level monitoring program. So this requires, and I'll show some graphics about this with the most recent results in a moment, but our water level monitoring program requires the yearly measurement of over 1,500 industrial and agricultural wells throughout the central and western part of the state. This is hand measurement of wells. It's very technically difficult. It's done in the wintertime. I'm excited to say that I have not participated in this yet because I'm from Houston and it's too cold. But these are folks who are moving through the central and western part of the state in that January time frame when we're not irrigating, so that they can get accurate measurements of water levels throughout the High Plains Aquifer in that central and western part of the state. We also have an array of index wells, around 35 wells, that are continuously monitoring water levels throughout those systems. We also have a water quality monitoring program that we're trying to build. So we are working with the Kansas Water Authority, the Kansas Water Office, and the KDHE to reinstate the state's ambient water quality measurement program throughout the state. This is a program that existed from '85 to 2000. Budget cuts around the time of 9/11 forced the state to pull that program down. But I'll say that it's an area of considerable concern for all of us. We're looking at nitrates, we're looking at uranium contamination, and that's a program that we're trying to figure out how to reinstate, how to restart, starting hopefully in fiscal year '24. We don't talk a whole lot about groundwater modeling, and I'll show a graphic about why this is important, but computer or numerical modeling of groundwater systems is really the key to delineating the dynamics of how water moves through the system. This is related not only to the water availability and water recharge rates, as well as water offtake rates, but it's also essential for understanding contaminant plume migration, for example. Finally, all of this needs to be built into databases that are managing hundreds of millions of measurements throughout the state historically. Those measurements have to be managed in databases that are accessible to the public, accessible to scientists, and accessible to decision makers. I'll say Kansas is leading the way with respect to our water resources programs, and I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. This is a map that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. I'm looking on page 8 now. So this is a map of the High Plains Aquifer and its distribution throughout central Kansas and western Kansas. The red dots on this map show the 1,500 or so individual water level measurements that we do on a yearly basis. As you can imagine, this is a massive effort. It takes many dozens of individuals to go out. We go out in early January, and we actually use an application system, a phone app system, and a computer app system that we invented at the Kansas Geological Survey that allows us to choreograph those measurements. So those teams who are moving out, they know because of the app, because of GPS measurements, and because of the application itself, exactly where to go, exactly the order to go in. They know what the measurements were from last year so that they have a range. They can understand, okay, am I going down 420 feet or am I going down 300 feet or whatever it may be. They have a range, and that allows them to generate much more accurate and much more precise measurements. It also allows me to, from a safety perspective, to know where our teams are and to get real-time understanding of what their measurements are. Also through that app, we're able to now generate the raw data from the water level measurements in a matter of days rather than a matter of months and even years. I know that this is a complicated series of maps, but I wanted to give you a perspective of the water level measurement program over the years. So this is 6 years from 2017 to 2018 timeframe, all the way through our latest data from 2022 to 2023 in the upper left. These are interpolated year-on-year changes in feet, and I know that the scale is very fine here, but effectively what I want you to take away from this is that blues on this map show areas of water recharge and periods of water recharge. Yellows on this map and oranges on this map show areas where water levels are going down, water levels are lowering. Because of this work, scientists and engineers from KGS are now able to turn this data around very, very quickly. So again, weeks, we're about to publish this year's report. There is a little bit of delay from the raw measurements. There's a processing step that has to go on where we have to identify data errors, identify measurement errors, retake some of those. So we actually go out a second time and retake some of those wells that are of question that show anomalous results year on year. That's an intensive process again. There's also interpretation that has to be done. Many times you'll see in the raw data that you'll have a significant rise from last year. That doesn't necessarily mean that things are good in the aquifer. That usually means actually that we had anomalously low levels the previous year, and then we're annealing back to an average level for those point areas. So there's some massaging that has to happen and some interpolation that has to happen to give the cogent results that we see in this map. When we put all of this together, and now I'm flipping over to page number 10. So this is a map that you can read. The scale is readable. This is a compilation of the past 5 years of High Plains aquifer systems. And what you can see is that this is the interpolated change in feet. On this map, green shows relatively small negative changes in water levels. Yellow shows 10 to 20 feet in water level change, and oranges shows 20 to 30 feet, and dark orange would show between 30 and 40 feet over the full span of that 5-year time frame. So these are the results. These are integrating this year's results, and it shows obviously that we have overall in the western part of the state and even in the central part of the state, we have some negative water level change. So in other words, we're depleting the aquifer faster than we're able to recharge it. And then of course in the southwesternmost part of the state, we have quite significant water level lowering, water level reductions. So these are the data that empower our GMDs and our water office and water authority to talk about how water is moving, how water is changing, and what those results may look like. I'll switch over to slide 11, which I think is a really important principle that I want to kind of make known. And this is work of Dr. Jim Butler at the Kansas Geological Survey, and it integrates work of again, dozens of folks over decades. But this graph shows on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, the annual water use in thousands of acre feet. And on the y-axis, it shows the annual water level change. And so what this shows is year on year, the blue dots are the year results for this average, on average for this area. And so year on year, this is many years from 2002 all the way through 2019. What this is showing is a very good trend, a very high correlation trend between the annual water use and the water level changes, where negatives show water level reductions, water level lowering. The important takeaway from this is that when the data align like this, when we're able to understand the characteristics of the aquifer, allow us to categorize the right data in the right areas, we can see beautiful trends like this with highly correlative data. What this shows is that the zero level, so on the y-axis, the zero level mark, I'm not sure if this has a laser pointer. I think it does. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so this line right there is a line that we call Q stable. And that Q stable shows the relationship of the annual water usage that would be required to have no effective change in the aquifer, no effective lowering of the aquifer. So for this area with these local characteristics, that is the level of water usage that this system can tolerate without having lowering. The locus of the data, I'll point again to the graph, the locus of the data I don't think the screen's going to let me do it. Where all the dots come together in the middle there with the line of water usage of around 406,000 acre feet. That shows the central tendency of this data set in water usage, and it shows that on average we're lowering over this period of time by about 0.4 feet in this area. The important thing to take away is when the data align like this, when we're able to pull these kinds of measurements into this kind of framework, we can start to make reasonable estimations of the kind of water usage reduction that it would take for this area with these characteristics to go from a net lowering of water levels to net stable water levels. These are the kinds of data that are hopefully empowering individual areas to make those decisions. And in fact, in Sheridan Lima 6, and I'll show some data from this in a couple of minutes, we've had those results where they lowered those reductions, they oversaw those reductions in water level usage. They were actually able to increase their agricultural yield over that period of time. So they saw success over that period of time, even with a marginal lowering, an incremental lowering of water use, and they saw positive results. So that's a win-win-win for our agricultural community and for the sustainability of the High Plains Aquifer. So to me, that's exciting. Equally exciting, I'll show a cartoon of an aquifer, and I'm showing a cartoon because showing the actual work is more complicated than I can explain. But this is to represent the importance of aquifer modeling. And what this is to show that when we think about our aquifers, when we think about our groundwater resources, we need to think about all the variables that are impacting those reservoirs. We need to think about inflow, natural inflow along gradients in an aquifer. We need to think about the precipitation recharge, so rainfall recharge. We need to think about return flow through the natural groundwater system, through the natural drainage of fluids through the subsurface. We need to think about pumping rates, how much we're taking off, of course. We need to think about delayed drainage and how long it takes for a droplet of water to move through the aquifer. We need to think about ET as evapotranspiration. I'm super excited. One of our scientists is doing a project with NASA to use satellite-based imagery to estimate evapotranspiration across the western part of the state of Kansas. It's really exciting, very, very cutting-edge work, but it helps us to inform that variable in a groundwater model. Ultimately, we also have to understand outflow and flow into the bedrock. But numerical models allow us to not only characterize what's happening, but also allow us to make predictions about what could happen. So this is a stochastic process, it's a statistical process, but it allows us to say, okay, how will this aquifer change and what will happen to the aquifer, or what could happen to the aquifer with different rates of precipitation? What could happen with different rates of offtake? What could happen when we change pumping rates? Or when we take senior water rights and junior water rights and new water rights into account. This is an empowering system that's in the hands of the groundwater management districts, in the hands of the LEMAs, in the hands of decision makers across the state, should allow us to better inform our decision-making process. There we go. We're working across the central and western part of the state to implement groundwater models. These are modeling systems that are extremely difficult to build. We've got a team of scientists who are recognized for being able to do that. So they're working across all but one of the GMDs right now to construct models. We've got a model also for the Kansas River system in the eastern part of the state, moving from all the way Manhattan all the way through to Kansas City. So these numerical models are incredibly important for us. They also have to be kept up to date. So this is not something that you make a model and it sits on the shelf, or it's used and it's always fresh. You have to continually update this with new information about contaminants. You have to update these with new information about water levels on a year-on-year basis. The impact, though, of all of these water quantity efforts results in maps like what you see here. This is a plot that demonstrates on the left-hand side, this is one estimation of the years until the aquifer itself, the aquifer thickness, reaches a minimum threshold. So a minimum threshold can be defined in lots of different ways, but it's effectively showing where we're at risk of losing a viable aquifer for industrial use, for agricultural use. On this map, browns show where the thickness has already reached that level. It's not to say that there's no water there. It's just saying that the viability of the reservoir there becomes of question. And then our scientists have worked to try to show areas of other risk from yellow to red, where you can think of under 25 years potential to reach that level. In reds, all the way down to relatively stable over 250 years in yellows on this map. The data on the right-hand side shows that Sheridan-Lima 6 success story. So this is effectively a pivot of the data that I showed before on the graph. What this is showing again is annual water use and then annual water level change. But now it's showing the years between the 2000s, the early 2000s, all the way up through 2011, where the annual water usage was relatively high, and the annual water level lowering, so the annual water level changes, those negatives were pretty significant. That Lima put into place practices to reduce, on average around 23%, 25 to 30%. When controlled for annual precipitation, they were able to reduce their water level use, and you move left up into the green area in the latter part of the 2010s. So that's a real success story in Sheridan-Lima 6 that we're really excited to have seen. I'm going to switch gears and talk about groundwater quality for a moment. This is a map. I'm on page 15. This is a map that shows the program, the KDHE program that was in place from 1985 to 2000. This in particular is showing nitrate contamination at around 200 sites across the state of Kansas. So these are monitoring sites that existed. The red boxes on this plot show our proposed areas for what I call phase one of a reinstatement of this program. So phase one would be going into targeted locations where we're concerned about or that we've actually seen significant contamination. In the Sedgwick, Wichita area, we're very interested and concerned about nitrate levels. In the Lakin area, Garden City area, we've measured significant uranium contamination well above the safe drinking water levels for those areas. And so we're working to understand how that happens, why that happens, and what can be done to mitigate that. In the northern part of the state, so north central, that red box shows other drainages that have similar characteristics to the ones that have seen uranium contamination in Lakin. And so we're looking to try to understand the hydrology there and contamination levels. And then finally, along the Kansas River corridor, we're looking for a range of different potential contaminants, including microplastics. So this is a program that needs to be put back in place. We're working with the Water Office and the Water Authority and KDHE to try to get the funding support to do that. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about my home base, which is energy resources. And forgive me for this. I'm going to look at page 17, and I want to spend a little bit of time looking at this complicated figure that to me, when I saw this and studied this, it kind of blew my mind. So this is called a Sankey diagram. It was developed by the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. You can go to their website. You can see these types of diagrams for the entire country. This one, however, is for the state of Kansas. So what this shows on the left-hand side is the amount of energy that's consumed in the state of Kansas, and this is about 1,200 trillion BTUs, British thermal units. I don't think in BTUs at all. I barely think in gigawatts, but that equates to around 351,000 gigawatt hours for the state of Kansas. So a lot of power is consumed. What this shows is that on the left-hand side, energy is produced in a range of different resources and resource types. So at the top, you have solar and nuclear resources. You have hydroelectric and wind. Wind is quite significant for the state of Kansas, as you know. Almost 50% of our electrical generation comes from wind. Moving down the list, you go into natural gas resources, coal resources, biomass resources, and then finally petroleum resources. When you move to the center part of this diagram, you can see how those energy resources on the left translate into different sectors of usage. So electrical generation at the top really comes from our renewable resources as well as natural gas to a certain extent, and significantly coal resources for the state of Kansas. About almost 200 BTUs, about 17% of our total energy consumption. As you move a little bit rightward, you'll see that our natural gas resources translate into residential use, of course. They translate into commercial use. They translate into industrial use. So that's all the manufacturing that we do. As you move to the bottom of the diagram, you can see that petroleum resources effectively all go to. So think of petroleum resources in this case as oil. Oil goes to transportation and some industrial use. You can think of it as both fuel as well as lubricants, lubes. The last thing, and part of the interesting sort of jaw drop on this type of diagram, this type of Sankey diagram, is the far right-hand side, which shows rejected energy. And by that, I mean energy that's effectively lost to usually heat. So it's usually translated into heat. So it's rejected energy. About 2/3 of the energy that we produce isn't even used. And then you go down to energy that's actually utilized. About 32%. So this is a way to think about all of our resources. It's also a way, in my opinion, to think about our industrial development and our industrial usage. So when I think about petroleum resources, oil in the state of Kansas, I really don't think of it as having anything to do with electrical generation. I think about it as transportation and industrial use. When I think about our natural gas resources, our coal resources, and our renewable resources, that diversified spectrum of power generation that we have, it really goes into a range of different things, both industrial, commercial, and electrical generation. So I love this diagram for talking about some of the intricacies of how we use power, where it comes from, and what it goes to. Now, this is a diagram, I'm switching over to page 18, and this is a diagram from my alma mater, from ExxonMobil, that they produce in their yearly outlook for energy. And what this does is this shows on the left-hand side the global sector demand for oil. It shows it from the years 2000 through 2050. This is from a range of open sources, such as the International Energy Agency. What this shows is that we are making strides in changing the light-duty vehicle fleet over into electrical vehicles, into hybrid vehicles. It also shows that we have really significant demand coming at us, both globally and nationally, from where we are today in 2023 through 2050. Now, this is just one discrete outcome from a range of different models, but it shows the average of the outcomes. And it shows that with population increases globally and with industrial development domestically, the heavy truck traffic, aviation, marine, and rail, those are still going to be consistent and significant and growing even uses of our oil and natural gas resources. So there are different ways to look at these data. There are different ways to think about the oil equivalent that we need to use, both gasoline and diesel. But the point that I want to make here is that this is a resource that's going to be needed for quite some time, we believe. And now I'll switch focuses on page 19 to oil and gas fields in the state of Kansas. So the map here on the left is a KGS map of the oil and gas fields, the distribution throughout Kansas. In southwesternmost Kansas, we have the Hugoton gas field that's been a national producer for a long, long time, especially in natural gas. In the central part of the state, we have the Central Kansas Uplift, which has a range of different oil fields and gas fields in the south part of the state. In the southeastern part of the state, we have a range of different oil and gas fields, including coal bed methane. which is a methodology of drilling and utilizing methane that's trapped, methane particles that are trapped within coal seams themselves. So Kansas has been historically an oil and gas state. We've got a very significant resource here. We have over 430,000 wells that have been drilled in the state since the 1880s. And it's a system that continues to keep being really significant despite changes in commodity prices, despite changes in the pace and prioritization of work. It's a consistently important resource for the state of Kansas and certainly for our tax basis. The next graph shows, this is really interesting data that Doug Lewis down in our Wichita office compiled for us, and it simply shows the state of new ITDs, or new intents to drill wells within the state of Kansas. And in 2022, Kansas was second only to Texas with respect to the intents to drill new wells. Now, I will say that Kansas wells are fundamentally different from the Texas wells that we've seen in an explosion of industrial development in the Permian Basin. These are not long-reach horizontal wells. These are traditionally vertical wells that are accessing multiple different reservoirs on the way down. But they're important. These are important wells for oil production and for the oil producers, most of whom are small independent oil producers within the state. So this to me is an exciting trend of potential development, and a place that our Energy Resources Division is working to try to support. Now, this is difficult stuff. These are small reservoirs. Oftentimes, by small, I mean they're relatively thin. That's why we drill them with vertical wells. They're very difficult to image on seismic, but they're robust when they produce. So that's a couple of words on oil and gas. I want to switch and now talk about some different types of new energy resources. I'm not going to spend too long talking about hydrogen, but I've been very focused myself, leading the team, leading the group of folks who are on a board to bring potential hydrogen development to the state of Kansas. The rather complicated diagram on the right-hand side is the Department of Energy's Swiss Army knife diagram. And what this does is it shows effectively that you can use a range of different electrical generation tools and techniques to produce electrical energy. So you can use renewable energy sources, you can use nuclear, you can use fossil fuels, hydrocarbon fuels, to run electrolysis to split water molecules into oxygen and hydrogen. Oxygen we can use for chemical processes, or we can vent to the atmosphere. Hydrogen we can use in an array of different tools and techniques. Those are shown on the right-hand side. Hydrogen can be used as a heat source itself, so it can be used as a high heat source for things like cement manufacturing. It can also be used as a feedstock for part of the cement manufacturing process. It can be used as a feedstock for chemical and industrial processes. It can be used, very importantly for us, as a feedstock to generate anhydrous ammonia. So it's a very simple, relatively simple process to take hydrogen, combine it with nitrogen, and make anhydrous ammonia. And if we can develop this throughout the state of Kansas, then we can be producing, we can become a net exporter of anhydrous ammonia potentially. From a range of different power sources. Hydrogen can also be used as a transportation fuel. So it can be used to help to diversify some of the transportation sector's power requirements, things like heavy truck, heavy vessels, and even aviation. So why in Kansas? Well, a couple of reasons. The DOE has put out a roadmap for creating a national hydrogen infrastructure. What this means is they want to create a series of regional hubs across the country where hydrogen is produced, hydrogen is stored, and hydrogen is utilized. We submitted a concept paper on behalf of the state of Kansas showing what resources we could bring to bear and the resources where we think Kansas has some strategic advantages. Those are effectively our geographical centrality in the center of the country, our diverse electrical generation portfolio. Again, we produce almost 50% of our resources in electrical gen come from renewable resources, come from wind. Those are inherently intermittent resources. And so wind generation doesn't happen when the wind doesn't blow. And so finding ways to create effectively batteries, to store that electrical potential, in this form, hydrogen, and then use that energy when we want to, becomes an important concept for our producers. The last one is bedded salt. So Kansas has the really considerable advantage of having bedded salt throughout the central and western part of the state. That bedded salt forms a low porosity, very low permeability medium where we can store hydrogen in large quantities for large periods of time. Now we already have a system where we store liquefied hydrocarbons. We used to store gases in the state as well in large quantities. Those same types of systems can be used to store hydrogen in large quantities, again, to use it when we want to. And that should have a stabilizing effect if we're able to scale this up. It should have a stabilizing effect in the supply of hydrogen and ultimately the supply of anhydrous ammonia throughout the western part of the state. I'm paying attention to time here. And so I'll talk very briefly. This is a distribution of the salt resources in blue in thickness in the western part of the state. And this is just to reinforce the point that, we believe that Kansas can become something of a U.S. strategic hydrogen reserve. We've talked about that in Washington, D.C. It's receiving a lot of interest. And we, again, think that it can be something that can be part of our economic development for the state of Kansas. These are maps of the Dakota Aquifer. The Dakota Aquifer is one that's characterized across the western part of the state and the central part of the state in a KGS Bulletin 260. The reason I bring this up is to remind me to talk about water resources and hydrogen. Obviously, the feedstock for hydrogen is water, and we need to be very careful with respect to utilization of our water for any purposes, but especially new economic development. We have to make sure that we're trying to pull water from the right resources and not taking it away from an already overallocated resource. In this case, we're looking at trying to use water that is effectively polluted, water that has higher chloride levels, higher total dissolved solids than can be used for freshwater systems or can be used for agriculture, and instead use that as water that we can use in hydrogen development systems. So the Dakota Aquifer, where it becomes saline, is one target. The Burton Plume on the Harvey County boundary is another target where we've identified it, we've looked at it, and we think that it can be used as essentially a salty water resource that we can use into hydrogen. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the level of potential economic development that we're talking about here. Again, the goal of the hydrogen hub concept is to optimize the use of existing power generation and optimize the use of power generation growth and diversification in our state. One of the goals is to produce something on the order of 300 to 500,000 tons of ammonia per year. That proximal distribution of and supply of anhydrous ammonia should help to stabilize the price of that commodity, which, as you may know, spiked to over $1,600 per ton over last year, up from $300 per ton. The scale of investment is massive, so we're talking about a total industrial and government investment of nearly $6 billion, with about $1 billion of that coming from the federal government. So pretty exciting scales. There are a bunch of amazing things that we do at the survey that I'm not going to let myself leave without talking about, because it's something that you may not have thought about, but it's got some sizzle to it. So we have a program that is run by Dr. Rick Miller and his team of researchers in subterranean sensing. By that, I'm talking about things like sinkholes, which are notoriously difficult to identify in the subsurface. Until they've happened, you may not know that they're there. The reason for that is that doing geophysics in the very shallow subsurface is very tricky to do, but it has really significant both gradual and catastrophic risks to our infrastructure, to our train and road infrastructure. You can see a few different images of this where a sinkhole has happened across a rail trestle. Another one where this big machine that we run from the KGS, this is a Vibrasize in the lower right-hand side. We actually have 2 of those machines that we've been able to purchase off of federal grants and then use throughout the state of Kansas. We've developed the technologies and the expertise to be very good at this sort of center of excellence level applications. And we use that for mine detection throughout the state of Kansas, for sinkhole detection throughout the state of Kansas, and for risk hazard assessment and mitigation. We have, however, adapted those same technologies for use in the military and homeland security departments. So I've got a few different graphics here. We do a lot of work with the Department of Defense and with Homeland Security. So we've got some pictures of our technology that was developed at the Kansas Geological Survey and has been deployed, for example, along the U.S.-Mexican border to identify drug running tunnels. So we've gone in and we've actually been able to identify those tunnels where bad guys are bringing drugs into the states. So some cool pictures of DEA guys and some of the tech that we're actually doing right along the border. We've also deployed that same technology in Afghanistan for military purposes. Again, subterranean sensing is a very important growth area for the Department of Defense. The bad guys know that they're basically visible anytime they're at the surface of the earth because of satellite technology and drones. And so they're going under. And so it's technologies like these that are really important. I'm moving along here pretty quickly. The state of Kansas has a very well-developed earthquake network. So this is a network of seismometers. The important thing about this is shown and can be demonstrated with the 2 maps on the left-hand side. So the upper map on that shows orange dots, and those are the arrays of earthquakes that are detectable from the USGS network. So the United States Geological Survey Network, which is a sparse network throughout the state. Over the same, or over a similar time span, but now 2015 to 2022, I'm showing the establishment of the Kansas Geological Survey's network of seismometers. The impact is that we can sense much smaller and a much denser network of earthquakes throughout the central and western and northern parts of the state because of the network that we've been able to develop. The importance of that is that when you sense the small earthquakes, when you can identify those, you can identify patterns of earthquake movement that make much more sense than only identifying the large earthquakes that happen. Another way to say that is that the small earthquakes that happen are a leading indicator of the large earthquakes that will happen on a statistical average. And so understanding those patterns, the spatial distribution, becomes really critically important for understanding why earthquakes happen throughout the state. We have capabilities, world-class capabilities in coring. We're one of the only surveys in the country, including the USGS, that has our own coring capabilities. And we've been able to do, through donations to us and then our own cores that we collect, establish a record of 5,500 wells or so that we store in our facilities just north of Lawrence, Kansas. In the Wichita area, we have records from 150,000 wells. These are mostly oil and gas wells, and that becomes another priceless data set with respect to not core, but cuttings in this case, so chips from the well that are pulled back up to the surface and categorized. Scientists from across the state, across the country, and indeed across the world come to our facilities in Lawrence and Wichita to work with these materials. They're a priceless data set for the state of Kansas. Notice that these buildings are they're corrugated steel buildings. So these are not reinforced buildings. If I lie awake at night, sometimes it's worrying about things like tornadoes hitting those types of facilities. We are working to try to pass a funding resolution that's going to do a couple of things. There's a one-time appropriation in that package to try to bring resources for new core facilities that we can use on-site. We can store materials on-site and use those laboratories. But we're also working to ameliorate a trend that we've seen in the survey of flat funding for more than 20 years. So we've had a flat appropriation for a long period of time. We're looking to try to increase that appropriation to stop the erosion of our ability to do all the work that we do. So in other words, some of our critical programs are really in jeopardy because we continue to lose scientists to retirement or to other states. And when we have those losses, rather than being able to reinstate those positions with new hires, we have to cannibalize those salaries so that we can retain the folks that we already have. So that's a trend that we're working really hard to try to change. We've been working on an appropriations request for enhanced funding for water and energy of an increase of $2.75 million in our sustained appropriation, and then a one-time appropriation of 3.8 to again improve those laboratory facilities for use. With that, I'll yield back to the chairman.
Thank you very much. There's probably some meetings started at 9:30 here, so unfortunately, we can listen to you all day. Actually, I'm sorry I missed out on part of your presentation, but thank you for coming in to start with, and we'll keep the negotiations going here. Tell them you're welcome anytime. So
very good. Thank you
Senator
for having me.
Francisco has a question before we go.
Not a question, but I just wanted to mention that in looking at the bill that we've been sent on groundwater districts, it does mention the Kansas Geological Survey as providing information. And so I'm going to make sure I understand how the funding relates to their ability to provide that information to all our groundwater districts.
Very much appreciated, Senator Francisco.
Any other final comments? Seeing none, thank you very much. Mr. Galvez.
Pleasure to speak with you.